Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Near Memo with David, Mike, and Greg. This is episode 151, a special episode in which David and Mike are going to talk about their experience in Brussels, Belgium, sitting through a marathon workshop in which Google was presenting its compliance measures in response to the Digital Markets Act, which is now in effect in Europe, and it pertains to 6 large, primarily US-based companies and TikTok, who are considered gatekeepers to the rest of the internet. And this was focused exclusively on Google or Alphabet formerly. So why don't you guys sort of set the scene and tell us what this hearing was all about and what happened?
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So European Commission organized a series of these workshops. All of the gatekeepers either had or are having or will have their chance to present how they are complying with the terms of the law. There were, Mike, probably 20 plus presenters from Google over the course of 7.5 or 8.5 hours. A handful of commissioners and staff sort of at the head of the dais, and then maybe 60 people or so in attendance in person to be able to ask questions, and another several dozen online. It was sort of unclear exactly how many were attending the online hearings, but online participants did have a chance to submit questions online, which were taken pretty regularly by commissioners. The day was broken up sort of by articles of the DMA that applied to specific lines of Google's business. So the first couple of sessions were less pertinent to our world. They were really about Android and Google Play primarily. And then the first session of the afternoon was around really Google's position in online search and Article 6(5) in particular, which is the anti-self-preferencing provision. The later sessions in the day were about primarily about user data and portability and sort of interoperability of user data with Google. So it was a very tightly run day. The commission stayed very much on schedule. Each of these sessions was about maybe an hour and a half or so in length. The Q&A periods, importantly, were, I think almost everyone got a chance to ask the questions that they wanted to ask. So it's not that the Q&A periods were sort of too short, but there was no ability really to sort of present counter arguments. And importantly, once Google answered, nobody was allowed to ask a follow-up question. So the whole day was largely, Google having a chance to present its side of the case, and not really much sort of rejoinder from plenty of interested parties who were there, who were far more directly in opposition to Google than we are as sort of outside observers. So that
and
was
in fact,
go ahead.
You were not allowed to criticize Google in your comments. It was strictly fact gathering. I mean, some people did.
So a couple of questioners did slide in a few sort of heavily sarcastic remarks, if not direct criticisms.
So who was there? Who were these would-be critics of Google? Who was in the room with you guys?
Primarily industry trade groups and also representatives from direct competitors of Google. For example, there was a woman from DuckDuckGo who asked several questions about the default search engine choice screens that are now required on Android devices and in Chrome browser. There were a number of comparison shopping engines present. And really, I think those were the most vocal Google critics and question askers, and many of them were frustrated that there wasn't a dedicated session about Google's position in comparison shopping. I gather there's been a very long-running case against Google for antitrust, specifically relating to Google Shopping, which I don't think the commissioners wanted to sort of go down that rabbit hole, is my guess, in terms of why they didn't make that a session. But primarily, I would say direct competitors and industry trade groups representing, for example, direct hotel suppliers or travel websites that Google was sort of potentially subjugating below their own results. And then there were a couple of consumer groups present. We got to know one of the women who was present, Vanessa from Bayuk, which is a European consumer organization. There were a couple of privacy focused groups, some app developers. So it was a pretty broad mix of Q&A attendees.
So why don't you guys give us a sense of, I mean, there were a lot of issues, it sounds like, that were addressed during the workshop. What was Google's argument or defense of its measures around kind of changing the SERP? We've documented this in a couple of pieces. In trying to comply with the DMA, Google has introduced certain new elements into the SERP and changed certain things, not linking to maps, places, sites, and several things that have been written about and that we can link to in the show notes. But what was Google saying about itself and its compliance there?
At the highest level, Google was saying, we are here to serve man or humans. We want to be a good partner, and we're trying to do the best we can to balance these competing needs. They positioned themselves as sort of not quite a victim, but they positioned themselves as having to deal with multitude of stakeholders who each have different needs. That was the big picture, and they framed that very eloquently, even if it isn't totally sort of quite accurate. And then specifically in search, a couple of things that we thought was interesting was that search was defined as general, Google organic search, and then vertical search, including hotels, airplanes, and shopping were the vertical searches. Local search and Google Maps were excluded from this particular compliance. Whether that exclusion, part of it, like Google Maps, was defined not as a search engine, but as I think you said, an information product, David?
Online information service or something like that. It was Google Search is an OSE, online search engine, and Google Maps is an OIS, and I unfortunately don't remember what the acronym stood for. But
Online information service, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, Google Maps was excluded from any discussion of remedies, as was local. Somehow local was excluded. And again, I don't know whether this is just a Google exclusion or whether it was agreed to by the EU. We're not sure. But all of local, which from our point of view is the most vertical of searches, was excluded. David, what do you have to add to that, to their positioning?
Yeah, I think that's all an accurate summary. I think, Google went out of its way to emphasize the number of internal resources that they've put towards compliance in terms of, thousands of engineers involved and tens of thousands of users surveyed and all of these kinds of things. And I genuinely did get the sense that this is, they are trying to take this seriously, given that, upwards of 10% of their revenues are at stake if the commission finds that they are not in compliance. But it was definite, I thought that the folks presenting from Google did a very good job of presenting Google's case. And, you certainly could have been persuaded as an outsider who wasn't as in the weeds as we are. You certainly would have been persuaded, I think, that Google was taking this seriously and was making a good faith effort to comply.
And what would you say is Google's sort of strongest argument here? I mean, we haven't unpacked all the arguments, and we can do that a little bit later. But what was the strongest point that Google made that it was in compliance in your opinions?
Well, I don't know if it was necessarily the strongest argument, but I think that their strongest position is sort of is the ambiguity of what it means to be in compliance. There has, at least as far as we know, at least as far as I know, the commission hasn't set down, sort of data-driven empirical, whether it's quotas or just sort of goalposts for Google to meet in terms of what makes it compliant. And so I think that Google is able, in that sort of gap to position itself, as Mike said, sort of stuck in between these competing interests of what they and the commissioners call aggregators. We would call them directories in the United States largely, and then direct suppliers, which are brands and small and medium-sized enterprises as part of that sort of direct supplier. So basically Google's position is, look, everybody wants traffic from us. Everybody's proposing different things, and we can't possibly make significant structural changes to the search engine because it's going to make at least one of those two competing interests mad. So
I'm sort of sympathetic to that. I mean, I think there's a cynical dimension to it. There's a sort of a rhetorical dimension, which you pointed out. And then there's also a way in which it's true. You know, in the United States, before the advent of the local PAC and, you know, the build out of Google My Business, or, you know, the precursor products, you know, the directories were doing arbitrage. They were capturing local searches and then reselling those searches to local businesses because the businesses didn't have the sophistication to rank in Google. And so the advent of the local PAC and some of the other changes that Google made gave people direct access to those businesses and harmed the directories. And, you know, there's a version of that now going on now. You've got a finite, notwithstanding the infinite scroll, you've got a finite number of slots, and people want those slots. And so who do you know, what do you prioritize? I think that that's a valid kind of dilemma, because you don't want to guarantee certain specific competitors traffic. That would be kind of unfair to everybody else who's not in that category. So I think there's some legitimacy to that.
There is definitely legitimacy to it. Google has leveraged that, though, from a strategic point of view, not cynical, to essentially divide the room into sections. And by focusing on specific tactical interface addendums to the search, they've managed to have people focus on one element of search, which is sending traffic someplace, rather than focusing on the big picture. I think the big picture is more interesting, and also, as David has pointed out in his suggested solution, probably easier to track. And what we think, to counter you, Greg, I mean, Google historically has sent traffic to the open web. Now, they claim they're sending as much or a little bit more traffic this year than last, but the reality is that Google searches have increased over time, and those searches, the amount of traffic they've sent to the open web, has not increased at the same rate as searches, I think, if my understanding is correct. And we think that globally, as a gatekeeper, Google's obligation in this situation is to direct traffic to the greater web, not just keep it for its own properties, whether that's a hotel or an airline or shopping or local. We think that Google has an obligation to send some significant percentage of traffic to the open web, and then let the open web compete for that within the constraints that Google imposes. By focusing on specific solutions like chips and links and carousels, it really reduces both what they have to do and how they're going to go about doing it. And so to me, the solution should be broader, and as should the performance measures of that should be broader. Are they sending more traffic to the web or not? And if they're not, they should. And that could be through Google Maps, local hotels, airlines, products, etc.
So you're in favor of us. Go ahead, David.
And I would say that the data behind that should be publicly verifiable in some Google Trends-like interface. I'm not asking Google to reveal specific query and click-through data, which actually they are required by the DMA to reveal to their competitors who pay a licensing fee. But I'm interested in some sort of publicly verifiable dashboard that shows by category, by vertical, what percentage of traffic is staying on Google in its own properties. Put a pin in that. What percentage of traffic is going to the open web? And I do think that is a reasonable boundary for the commission to set, and let Google innovate however it wants to inside of that very broad guideline of amount of traffic that should go elsewhere and versus the amount of traffic that Google captures for itself.
Well, so what is? Go ahead.
interestingly, the thing that sort of galled me as an observer is that Google is trying to say that Google business profiles aren't a Google-owned property. I mean, it's the name of the product is Google Business Profiles. They are soliciting information from business owners. They are capturing information from Google users and displaying that in a search result. And they, in the PDF of their formal response, which they published on, I think, March 7th, they highlighted a graphic showing all of the links to maps that they had removed, but all of the Google business profiles are still there. And again, this is from I think anyone who's not working at Google, it has an internal Google view of how search works. I think any external observer would say that Google business profiles are a Google property. You are clicking something that contains information only available on Google. And it is not certainly not a panel that is available to competitive search engines or aggregators. And so in my mind, that Google business profiles being preferenced in so many local searches and Google hotel profiles being preferenced in so many hotel searches seems to me not to be in compliance with Article 6.5.
Well, Google
although one here in this context, cynically and perhaps with a little bit of a tin hat on, one could argue that NMX was a predecessor to their response to this. In other words, they fully integrated Google Business Profiles into search as an interface to argue that it is an integral part of search as opposed to part of their larger knowledge graph project, which I think is a better description of it.
So I would make the point that Google's ultimate control over the business profile, how it looks, the information contained within it, the inclusion of third-party data in it, the way in which it controls the entire process of verification and suspensions and so on and so forth, makes it a Google product. It's not a website that the third party controls. It contains information from third parties, but it's ultimately Google. Google's exercise of total control over it makes it a Google product. Sort of full stop is what I would argue. What I want to explore with something you just referenced, Mike, which is the Google position, as I understood it from your piece, David, that Google's trying to argue that degrading the search experience is not what is required by the DMA, which I thought was a very interesting. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but I thought that was a very interesting.
That was a very close to a direct quote from Oliver Bethel, who's Google's public policy face for these hearings.
So that's kind of the exception that can swallow the rule in a certain sense. In that you can what does degraded mean in this context? It can include anything and everything that Google wants to throw in there. Well, this is an intrinsic part of the search experience, as Mike just alluded to. That to me was the most fascinating part of what you said about Google's defense of its position.
And you're seeing some of that with Google, say, cutting off a link from search to Google Maps in the search results in the EU, and you're seeing consumers not being particularly happy with that, or at least it seems that way. It's inconvenient. And my response to that is, okay, great. Include Google Maps, include local. Don't limit self-preferencing. Just monitor and encourage traffic to the open web from all of these other vertical search engines, and make sure that people get to the best place to solve their problem at the end. And that may or may not be Google, and probably isn't Google. In other words, not booking on Google, not looking at availability on Google, those sorts of things. But
I would say I think Google is being, I would say, intentionally lazy with its definition of what would degrade experience. I guess I would rather see them, if not embrace, at least accept a position where they understand the intention behind Article 6.5, and they try to build a different interface that is much more in compliance, that users might actually prefer to the pack. I mean, we've seen, I would say, nominal changes to the pack, and we've certainly seen features added to the pack, like the image carousels and these kinds of things over the last couple of years. But the pack in its current form is, I would say, largely the same over the last 7 or 8 years, it actually feels pretty stale to me. Maybe this can be used as a way to build an even better user interface that actually improves the search quality experience, the search experience, which I think probably should be one of the positive outcomes of the DMA, is that Google is actually forced to innovate more itself as opposed to just sitting on its heels and capturing more traffic and retaining more ad revenue.
Yeah, Google doesn't agree, obviously, with your position. I mean, in their response in the U.S. to the sort of ongoing search default search antitrust action that is yet to be fully decided, they took the position that they are highly innovative in search, that their quasi-monopoly or monopoly position in search has not impacted innovation at all. They've done X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E in terms of search innovation. So their position is that they are being very innovative, and that something like the DMA or any externally imposed constraints hamper or negatively impact innovation, which I think is
I would add, from their point of view, negatively impact potential income sources, negatively impact their ability to monetize every search ad nauseum, right? I mean, I think that is
that's the elephant in the room. That's the elephant in the room. Did that get brought up in the hearing at all? The monetization?
Not really, no.
It did not. Yeah. And my fear is that, as we're seeing in the United States, that with the monetization of local service ads, et cetera, I mean, that Google is moving very aggressively to monetizing, essentially making local pay to play, right? That with ads and other things, local service ads and location extensions, et cetera.
And we should note in our specific research, we did not see Google heavily monetizing restaurant searches in Ireland. I think ads only showed up 20% of the time, and when they showed up, it was usually 1 or 2 ads, not the usual 4 that you'd see for lawyers, for example, in the United States. So this was not a particularly heavily monetized category. But to Mike's point, hotels are a very heavily monetized category for Google. And this was one of the main verticals, as the commission defines verticals, that they actually announced an investigation into earlier this week, following the hearings last week. So I do think that the commission, even though it didn't come up during the hearings, I feel like that the commission is probably aware of the risk to consumers and suppliers and aggregators of Google increasingly monetizing its own internal product.
Yeah, we should just kind of, for clarification, you guys attended the hearing last week
on March 21st. Yeah,
right, and then on Monday, which is the 24th, I believe,
25th, I think.
Or the 25th, the commission announced an investigation into Apple, Alphabet, and I think Amazon was on there, but I don't remember. So it was after the hearing happened, they proceeded with an investigation. So what do you think that says about the commission's point of view on what was presented by Google during its workshop, if anything?
Well, I'm not sure it says much. So Google submitted its written response to the commission on, I believe, March 7th. It was much earlier in the month. And so there was about a 2-week lag where the commission would have had time to review that written response and then also, take into account things that were said and to maybe sort of take the temperature of the room in terms of the questions that were asked. But you have to think that they were at least skeptical of Google's written report when it came out earlier in the month, and that their opinion probably was not, their skepticism probably was not diminished by Google's presentation last Thursday to be able to announce an investigation, within 48 business hours after that concluded. So,
did the topic of AI in search, SGE, come up at all? I mean, I don't know how widely rolled out in Europe it is. I think they're starting to expose it in Europe in certain places, but the Europeans, of course, have AI rules that were formalized. But did that come up in the hearing at all, SGE or AI?
No, it didn't. It was, and it's one of my concerns long haul as the nature of search presentation changes, and more of it, and this was something I think we mentioned in that last article, as more and more of it moves into this sort of display format with this sort of auto-generated content, that traffic to the open web, as we've seen over the last few months, could decrease even further, which is why the idea of making sure that as a gateway, they are letting people through the gateway and get out the other side is an important concept. And I think AI, which was not covered, it's sort of a future thing. But it certainly, the writing is on the wall, and if the requirements that the commission puts in place are not broad enough, then it may be a way around and force a whole nother set of hearings.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's the thing is that SGE is a Google product, even though it contains links. But we don't know, we don't have any data really, or there's minimal data on consumer engagement with SGE. Are consumers clicking on those links? Is an SGE result a jumping off point for traffic to third-party websites? Google has that data, but it hasn't shared any of that data. And as far as I'm aware, there's no third-party data that has really talked about that. There's a lot of data about, how SGE impacts the look and feel of the page and, its potential impact on traffic, hypothetically, but no real consumer data. And we haven't seen enough in our research. We haven't seen enough users with access to SGE to really assess that ourselves.
Yeah, and I would just highlight, Greg, you called SGE a Google product. I'm not sure that Google would define it as a Google product.
No, they clearly would not.
Part of the core search experience.
Right.
And again, they are arguing very aggressively in these commission proceedings. They're arguing very aggressively that the core search experience is outside the bounds of Article 6.5. So
right, and that's a very sort of clever legal rhetorical position, because that again sort of is that can consume the entirety of the DMA requirements. Everything on this page is part of the course. They probably can't get away with that, but they could say all these pieces that are effectively Google products are outside of the core search, are outside of the DMA because they're part of the core search experience. They can just, it's about who controls the terms of the debate here.
Yep.
What is core to Google search experience, and what is a Google product that is really about keeping people on Google and monetizing, traffic for itself.
Right. And Google, at this meeting, did a great job of sort of managing their way around that conversation. Whether the EU commissioners, bought it, we don't know yet. The fact that they started an investigation so quickly would imply that they have some amount of skepticism.
So let's, in our sort of remaining few minutes, let's talk about, sort of the future and remedies and maybe a little bit about consumer behavior. And you guys have already sort of raised the open web versus Google kind of broad remedy perspective or metrics, how you measure success. But what do you think the European Commission should be doing around concrete metrics or KPIs to really determine if Google is in compliance or not?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'd say is that I think forcing a little more data transparency from Google would be good for the commission. It would be good, give them, something they could point to in terms of if they do come down with some sort of finding of non-compliance. Having publicly available data to justify that conclusion, I think makes that conclusion more defensible. I think it's certainly better for society for Google to be more transparent about some of these ranking and query and ranking and click-through data. Again, I'm not looking for any kind of secret sauce algorithm, but just generally speaking, percentage of clicks by category that are leaving Google. And I think honestly, it'd be better for Google, right? If they're seen to be a better player in terms of sending traffic to the open web than Facebook or Meta or ByteDance or Microsoft, which they hadn't even had their workshop yet by the time we left Brussels. It positions them in much better public standing. We've already seen Google. I think Google could not have been happier with the timing of the DOJ investigation into Apple being announced on the same day of this workshop in Brussels. And so I think it would be in Google's interest to put on a better PR initiative around data transparency than the other gatekeepers are doing. So I think that would be the first step in any remedy.
And I would say the second step would be to, like they're making consumer behavior available to other search engines, I believe that on those entities that are uniquely Google's, that Google has become, because of their power as a monopoly, have been able to build out unique entity data and a graph of that data that they alone control. And since I see the future of the web as a entity-based search experience, I believe that they should be sharing that data with the other search engines as well, so that they could compete with Google on things like local, on things like maps, on things like hotel availability, et cetera, those that are unique to them.
And what about kind of consumer response to all of this? I mean, we talked a little bit about the dissatisfaction that some consumers have expressed around the delinking of Google Maps in a local search context. What happens if Google makes a bunch of changes in its SERP and consumers don't respond to those? In other words, the kind of example we saw in Ireland, where in a restaurant search context, people were clicking on the local pack and they weren't really using the places sites features that Google has implemented as part of its compliance effort. What happens if consumers have been so conditioned by Google and are so habituated to Google that they just simply ignore changes in the SERP and do the stuff that they've always been doing?
Well, I would say, Greg, that keep in mind that by far and away the number two click or lack of click, right? Number one was 0 clicks. Google keeps the traffic. By far and away, the number two click, only a few positions behind, was TripAdvisor, right? And so even though folks weren't clicking on the DMA response places sites carousel, they were very interested in seeking out TripAdvisor for these restaurant queries. And so it's entirely possible that the consumer experience could be improved if Google were to show more TripAdvisor content or make the TripAdvisor content more visually interesting than its own Google Business Profile results, right? So I think I reject the, well, we can't change anything because it will degrade the experience. Like, I think that is a total red herring. And that while I don't think that the commission should be involved in micromanaging user interfaces, I do think that setting broad guidelines should encourage Google to innovate in a way that does not degrade the consumer experience. They should absolutely be worried about people choosing a different search engine, but they should, as a gatekeeper, be innovating within that dominant market position to provide a new, equally good, if not better, consumer search experience in these verticals where, again, right now, they are clearly self-preferencing with respect to Google Business Profiles.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, we spoke with somebody at the conference who said, yeah, they were annoyed by the fact they couldn't link over to Maps, but now they just start their searches on Maps instead of on Google. So in that scenario, Google builds another search monopoly, which currently isn't even classified under the DMA as a search engine. So the user goes to Google, which is what I've been doing here, right? I mean, on my trip to Europe, I've been using Google Maps to look up entities and then going over to Apple Maps to get me there, which is, Google is winning in that scenario as well. And I think, which is why I think Google Maps should be included in this bigger picture.
So where do we go from here? I mean, where did the commission leave it? We talked about the investigation that's been opened, but what do you think the future holds for DMA compliance? One of the questions I think that's been raised by Mark Gurman at Bloomberg, but maybe he's not the right writer. He's writing about Apple, actually. It's a Bloomberg writer, but it's not Mark Gurman. is this going to have any real teeth, or is this going to be like GDPR for many, many months where, there was this sort of perfunctory compliance. There were no penalties for anybody who seemed to be skirting the rule or sort of manipulatively complying. What's going to happen now, do you think?
Well, the commission did say in their press release on Monday that they announced the investigation, that they're trying to get the investigation wrapped up within 12 months. So to me, that is a lightning fast timeline for any kind of government action. So I think that's to me, that signals that they are trying to make the Digital Markets Act have teeth. One way or another, right? They may find that Google actually is in compliance, or Google may introduce a solution that is more in compliance than what they're doing today. But I think the fact that they're not planning to let this drag on for years in the same way that the shopping case apparently has been in Europe, I think that is a big change. And I would expect an answer one way or the other actually is probably good for Google as well, right? They'll either take the stock hit or they'll get the stock jump, but at least it won't be sort of hanging over their heads indefinitely.
And to answer that question from Google's point of view, I think Google is going to go on a full court press, including sending out their attack dogs from third-party chambers they're a member of, to criticize alternative solutions. So I think Google's going to go on a very forceful PR campaign that is both has positive aspects and more attack-driven aspects by third party, to try to position themselves effectively in this coming investigation.
Now, do we know if the Connected Commerce Council has opened a Brussels office yet? I wouldn't be surprised if that's too far in the future.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot more that could be said about this, but we're out of time. We will be covering this on an ongoing basis and commenting on it, and bringing this information to you, because I think there's relevance to a North American audience as well. As Google makes changes in Europe, some of those changes will also take place in the US, as we've seen with some of the appeal processes in Google Business Profile. So this is something we'll be following very closely and very involved with. Any last thought?
I would just say, we can't predict the future, but I would say that this has a chance of being at least as impactful as the SGE rollout to local marketers in Europe. So I think if you're not paying attention to the DMA and Google's responses to the DMA, and you're sort of laser focused on SGE, you're sort of missing a little bit of the forest for the trees here.
And the Digital Services Act also is a companion to the DMA, which has content moderation implications, which we may see play out over time as well. So that'll be interesting to see in addition. Mike, any last thoughts?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And next week, we have a very special interview with John Jantz, who's going to be of DuckDuckGo Marketing, who's going to be talking about fractional CMOs and the benefits that that strategic position can bring to agencies and marketers in general. So that'll be a very interesting interview next week. So thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.